Hey, your viewers and viewers, my name is General Red Strategist and welcome back to Being Hunted, episode 520. Back, of course, on the map I had in the previous episode to do another podcast-style video. So, last time I was talking about that whole subject of being a critical thinker, and as I pretty much mentioned, I am actually recording this straight after that one, so it's the same day, 12th of November. It's just gone 8:05 in the evening. Yes, I am dating the video, and at 9 o'clock, obviously, we've got the the remembrance service coming from the Royal Albert Hall on television, which I do want to watch. And so yeah, whilst I'm going to date this video now, obviously by the time this episode of Sir goes out, it'll be much later in November. It'll be past Remembrance Day and all that. But I kind of wanted to maybe talk a little bit about this subject, obviously, of remembrance and all that. And now I think I have talked about the subject of remembrance before in So You're Being Hunted, but I can't really remember too much of what I actually said. So apologies if this podcast style episode actually turns into a bit of a repeat of things that I've actually just said before. It basically just becomes, Remembrance Discussion 2.0 and all that. But thing is, obviously, so of course here in the UK we have the remembrance sort of Royal Albert Hall service and all that every November, because the 11th of November is the date on which World War I ended and all that, and the service always takes place soon after that. And of course tomorrow, November 13th, there will be the Cenotaph service live from London, where the monarch lays a wreath, and so do all the political leaders of the country, and then they have the big march past the Cenotaph and all that. Of course, it'll be King Charles's, I think, first cenotaph as the king, basically. Because obviously it won't be his first cenotaph service that he's been to, of course. Because obviously he's been to plenty of them as in his duties as the Prince of Wales before he became the monarch. But this will be his first sort of cenotaph as king. And of course it'll also be, I'm assuming he'll be there at the Royal Albert Hall service tonight as well. In his first one as king of the UK. But yeah, that's not what I wanted to talk about. I don't want to talk about the royal family. That's not the subject of conversation for this episode. Mainly, I was just kind of thinking, about how, obviously in my line of work as an academic, I'm in the field of international relations, security, stuff like that, and it's interesting because on Friday the 11th. I had a seminar where I was talking to some of the students on one course, and we were actually talking about the topic of remembrance and commemoration of wars and conflict, which is a new seminar on this course that I was on. We've not done this in the past, but the course designers decided to actually implement this as part of it, since when they looked at their course timings, they realised that they were going to have a session that fell on Friday the 11th of November. So they decided to just have like a reflective session talking about remembrance and commemoration. And it's always interesting actually hearing about how other countries go about the business of commemoration of wars and remembrance of the dead and the fallen in their own national contexts. Because the thing is, on the courses that I go to, usually there is a fair smattering of students who come from all over the world, from a whole range of countries. And the thing is, what was just really, really interesting about that session was thinking about how the act of remembrance is sometimes used quite politically, and the ways in many ways, I suppose it kind of gets into a broader debate about the use and misuse of history, which I think is another subject I've kind of talked about before here on the channel, how often history is taken and distorted in order to produce certain political narratives, even if that distortion of history produces a view of history that's not really valid or super accurate. Where the hell are you going? Well, the pheasants in this game always love killing themselves. Drowned pheasant, ladies and gentlemen. But yeah, so the debate about remembrance obviously ties in to that, because the thing is, here in the UK we have the red poppy as like a symbol of Remembrance Day, and of course the symbolism of that is it goes back to Flanders Field it goes back to World War One, with, you know, poppies growing on the battlefields. And so we use that blood red poppy as like a symbol of remembrance, of remembering the fallen. But the problem is, certainly in recent years, you know, there's been sort of controversy about the poppy in terms of whether it's really an appropriate symbol, because, you know, depending on your viewpoint, some people argue that in some ways the poppy has been kind of hijacked, and instead of being a symbol of just remembrance and kind of like a warning against the horrors of war, certain political quarters and groups have tried sort of co-opting it into more of like a glorification of Britain's kind of imperial past. And some people argue that as a result, the line between commemorating war and glorifying it have started to become a bit blurred, and so people have got a bit uncomfortable with that. Thing is, this is not obviously a universal view that's shared by everybody. It's a bit of a debate. Some people, you know, do very much argue that no, the poppy is still very much a symbol of remembrance, not a symbol of glorifying war, and therefore we should still use them. But it just kind of ties in, you know, I think quite interestingly with that debate about how history sometimes is used and misused, and how even the act of remembrance can sometimes be used to kind of tell, well, to phrase it this way, how it can be used to kind of tell stories about ourselves and to try and make us feel a certain way about our own identity. Because the thing is, like, again, this may be something I've mentioned before in one of my So You Being Hunted podcast style episodes, but here in the UK, for example, a lot of people comment that there is a real kind of fixation on World War II in our history, i.e., well, I shouldn't say in our history, I should say in our discourse and our popular rhetoric about history. So, on one level, that's easy to understand, because World War II was fucking traumatic for the UK, you know? There was a stage in World War II where Britain felt isolated early on, because, you know, France had fallen, and, you know, we were kind of the only sort of European power at one point that was left standing against Germany. And, you know, there were very big questions at that time about, you know, would Britain survive this war? Was it going to be starved into submission by a combination of German aerial bombing of airfields and industry, and combined with, of course, the U-boat campaign, sinking all the merchant shipping that the UK is dependent upon for its economic survival? And, you know, it was also traumatic because prior to that, you know, Britain was a major player in the world. It was a country which had a huge empire. It was a country that was very much a kingmaker. It was a rule maker on the international stage. But World War II was kind of the final nail in the coffin that pretty much said, nope, you're not any of that anymore. Because obviously after World War II, you know, the empire fragmented. Countries that had previously been part of the empire started to demand independence. They started to become independent. And of course, in 1945, when the World War actually ended, you know, the British economy was in tatters, and the country had just been bombed to oblivion. So many people had died. So yes, on one level, World War II is something that we, you know, in Britain we do tend to fixate on because it was such a nationally traumatic situation. But I think World War II, we also tend to fixate on it because it's an element of our history which lends itself to sort of easy political narratives about our place in the world. Because the thing is, I think, you know, World War II is one of those conflicts in history where it is sort of universally accepted that we were right to go to war and that we were fighting against something that was bad. And so as a result, from a moral point of view, a lot of people can look back on that and they say, you know, this is Britain doing good on the international stage. But I think where the debates really sort of comes from in regards to the use and misuse of history is that kind of concern about how do we sort of overemphasise World War II to the exclusion of other moments in our history where Britain maybe hasn't been as much of a benevolent force on the international stage as it maybe likes to believe that it has been. And, you know, another kind of area where that debate plays out is, for example, our conversations about British imperialism, you know, do we, you know, what sort of view do you take of it? Because obviously people can be quite polarised on that, between those who argued that for all its faults British imperialism did bring a lot of good to other countries, and on the other side of course people who say it doesn't matter what good it brought. At the end of the day it was an imperial system, it was based on the subjugation of other peoples and countries. How can that ever be good? So yeah, there's definitely a very sensitive debate around that subject, and I'm not going to, you know, I mean, I'm not going to get too much into that, but, you know, if you wanted to know my personal view, I try to be sort of objective and balanced in my assessment of it. Because yeah, you could argue that there are things that British imperialism did bring to other parts of the world which they have benefited from, but I will concede that that doesn't change the fact that this was an empire. This was a system that was built on subjugation and exploitation of other peoples and their territories. And in that respect, the British Empire isn't something that you should be proud of, at least in my eyes. It's more something that you should regard with a very careful eye, acknowledging maybe that yes, there are some positives, but overall it was still nevertheless a system that was based on subjugation, and we should always remember that and never kind of lose sight of that. So yeah, I always try to take sort of a neutral, objective, balanced view of it that doesn't seek to glorify the empire. So yeah, it's just that question of the stories we tell about ourselves, and how, you know, it's interesting how certain aspects of our history we often fixate on to try and formulate certain political narratives about how good we are, even when other aspects of our history actually show that that's not always true. There are times when we have been quite bad. I mean, you know, examples of that are things like, you know, when you look at how heavy-handed the British could be in some of their colonial possessions. And yes, you know, there is of course that argument that you always do have to take in mind, in that, you know, you have to be careful applying modern day moral standards to the past. And I always say, you know, that is a valid point. You do have to be careful. But what I think more than anything that point tells us is, it's not that we can't make moral judgments about the past, because I'd say you have to, right? In order to make progress in society, in order to make progress as a human civilization, that does necessitate that we look back on our history and actually judge the things that came before, whether they were good or bad. So, you know, the whole argument about you know, you've got to be careful applying a moral standard from one time period back to another, yes, but that doesn't mean you can't. What it, I think, more than anything means is you've got to try and take a balanced view before you come to your judgment. You've got to look at the people in the past, and you've got to ask yourself, with their upbringing and the information, the knowledge that they had available to them, the societies in which they were brought up, the viewpoints that they no doubt would have been surrounded by, you know, is it understandable why they did the things they did, the choices that they made? And then you get to the next big question, which is, okay, could they have done anything different in that moment, whatever decision of theirs it is you're looking at? Were there other options available to them? And if so, what were they, and why did they not go with them? Was there a valid reason they didn't go with them? And then you get to an even bigger question, which is, okay, put yourself in their shoes. If you were in that situation at that time, would you have made the same decision? Or would you have made a different decision? And if so, why? Why would you have made that decision? And I think it's then, and only then, once you've tried to sort of get more and more of a sense of the context of what happened back then, and the motivations, the things that the people back then making the decisions would likely have had in mind, then I think that's when you can start to make your moral judgment. Oh god, sorry. I'm getting gas from my tea. But there's also an argument with that whole, you know, basically that whole argument about applying moral standards back to the past and how that can be a bit of a danger. You know, there is a word for that. It's called presentism, i.e. applying present-day standards to the past as though they automatically apply, when actually not necessarily. And yeah, you know, there is validity in that argument that you do have to take into account. But, you know, it's not a perfect argument. There are counters to it as well that also have to be borne in mind. And so you do have to find that balance. So, for example, you know, it's not to say that you can't apply a moral judgment to what came before, because otherwise how do we advance as a society? How do we become enlightened? How do we work out whether things were good or bad? That, to me, always, you know, necessitates that we look back and make a judgment. But, you know, like I say, more than anything, what it's trying to say is try and make a balanced and careful judgment. You know, really examine what people in the past did and try and understand why they did it before you make your judgment. And that's not to say that, you know, understanding what they did will somehow make you take their side. You know, the end result of that may well be that you still disagree with what they did, and you still say, no, it was a bad thing. Therefore, you know, that's fine. So yeah, but there's also other arguments as well that you have to counterbalance with the whole presentism thing. So one of them is, you know, are there certain historical events where it is impossible to take a neutral kind of view of it? So for example, like the Holocaust, can you really sit on the fence with something like that? I would argue, at the very least, it's difficult to do that from a moral point of view. And the other thing I also would say, just to add another, I think another kind of complex layer onto this, is, you know, sometimes I think we talk as though our morals that we have today, sometimes I think we treat them as though they evolved in a vacuum, as though the morals that we hold today and the morals that our ancestors held, as though they are completely radically different from each other. But I would say that, well, no, not necessarily. I would say that's not necessarily true, because the thing is, like, you have to ask yourself, where did our current morals, our current moral standpoint, our current moral values, where did they come from? And often you'll find that, well, they evolved from what came before. So it's not the case that necessarily that our morals of today and the morals of the past were completely different to each other. You will find commonalities, things like that. So for example, you know, today we know and accept that the slave trade, you know, the trade in African slaves was utterly immoral and reprehensible. You know, we all know and accept that. And so you might sort of look back on history and think, okay, you know, should we judge the people of the past as being morally reprehensible for practicing it? At least those, you know, who advocated and traded in slaves and things like that. And I would say to those who might argue that, oh, well, you know, we've got to be careful doing that because, you know, you're applying moral standards to people in the past. Well, you know, I get where you're coming from, but at the same time I would also say, just to make this more complex, you have to remember that there's lots of evidence that even people in the past, at that time, there are plenty of people in those times who would actually agree with us at present that slavery was bad. For instance, look at like the abolitionist movements in the 19th century. You know, people like William Wilberforce, people like that. Because then you realise that, you know, this moral abhorrence of slavery that we have today, this didn't just evolve in a vacuum. It didn't come from nowhere. It's not unique to the present day. Its roots are back in history. In fact, you know, you could probably go further back than the 19th century as well. You could probably go back to the earliest days of slave trading, when the European powers began trading African slaves. And you will find evidence of, for example, like Christian priests, for instance, who argued that it was immoral and that it was against the laws of God to trade in human lives like that. So no, I would argue that you have to sometimes be careful with how far you take the presentism argument. Even though presentism does have validity to it, there's a limit to how far you can take that as well. So I always just think it's a fascinating subject area. And yeah, I mean, I said earlier I was going to talk about remembrance, but really I think what I meant was I'm going to talk about deeper underlying issues that the issue of remembrance and commemoration of war does actually bring about and tie into. So yeah, I need to drink up my tea, it's getting cold. Alright, yeah, it's definitely getting a bit It's not even lukewarm. It's getting a bit colder now. I really need to drink it up. Ooh. Apologies. You all heard me gulping there. Oh god. I've got something in my mouth. Ugh, a bit like calcium build-up or something from my bloody kettle, no doubt. That's the problem with living down south. It's a hard water area, so you get friggin', you know, like calcium build-up sometimes in your kettle and on your taps that you have to clean and all that. I'll have to give my kettle a bit of a clean. Alright, before I start rambling on about that, I think we'll wrap up here. This was episode 520 of So Being Hunted with me, General Red Strategist. Another podcast-style episode right there, ladies and gentlemen. God, yeah, it's been a fascinating subject actually discussing this, and I could probably talk about other subjects as well, to kind of continue it, just from my own sort of, you know, academic career and all that. But yeah, maybe that's for a future podcast-style episode. Other than that, I think we'll wrap up here, so Facebook to the links down below, along with the link to my propagandist channel for anyone interested. And if you enjoyed, a like is always appreciated. More than that, I'm signing off now. Goodbye, everybody. Kind of curious to see what's in the middle of that thing, though, since that's where he seems to be hanging around. So I got one of the Hook's blessings to that thing over there, but what did that do? Not entirely certain. Okay, that weird sort of discordant music seems to play whenever he's nearby. So I guess that's your kind of auditory indicator that you're in danger or that he's nearby or whatever. Right, there's got to be something in there, right? Yes, it looks like there's a pool that we can get through. So we've just got to get into the middle, that's all. Right. He shouldn't be able to see me, should he? As long as I sort of stay crouched, I think he can't really do anything unless he literally walks right into me. Right, you go over there. Actually, hang on a minute.